On a quiet, foggy morning, an elderly woman's life was about to change forever. What began as a routine day soon turned into an extraordinary journey of love, sacrifice, and unexpected challenges. When she opened her front door to find a tiny infant abandoned on her doorstep, she had no idea that this moment would fill her life with both immeasurable joy and profound sorrow. As the years passed, the bond between the woman and the boy she named Samuel grew stronger, filled with laughter and the warmth of a love that brought new meaning to both their lives. But life, with all its unpredictable twists, soon tested this bond in ways they could never have imagined. Yet even in the darkest moments, the light of hope and the power of love shone through, leading them to a place of peace and fulfillment. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. On a chilly, fog-laden morning in a small, unassuming town, an elderly woman's life took an unexpected turn. As the first rays of dawn struggled to pierce through the mist, she shuffled to her front door, expecting nothing more than the usual stillness of her quiet existence. But as she opened the door, a gasp escaped her lips. There, swaddled in a threadbare blanket, lay a tiny, vulnerable infant. The baby's soft cries broke the silence, and with a heart full of both shock and a profound sense of duty, she gently lifted the child into her arms. The woman, who had long since resigned herself to a life of solitude, felt an overwhelming rush of emotions. Her once empty home, filled only with the echoes of her past, now resonated with the tender sounds of new life. The baby, abandoned and alone, was now her responsibility, and with each passing day she poured all her love and care into raising the child. She marveled at every milestone, every coo-oh, every smile, and as the years went by, the bond between them grew ever stronger. The child, who she named Samuel, became the light of her life, bringing joy to her days and giving her a renewed sense of purpose. Samuel grew into a bright and energetic young boy, his laughter filling the small house with warmth and vitality. The elderly woman, though her body was beginning to show the signs of age, found a new lease on life through the boy she had come to love as her own son. She took pride in watching him flourish, nurturing his inquisitive nature and guiding him with the wisdom of her years. Together, they navigated the challenges that life threw their way, creating a world within the walls of their modest home that was rich in love and mutual respect. But as time marched on, the inevitable trials of life began to surface. Samuel, now a young man with dreams and ambitions, started to feel the tug of a world beyond the confines of their small town. The elderly woman, proud but also fearful, watched as he began to spread his wings, hoping that the values she had instilled in him would serve him well in the wider world. However, life has a way of bringing unforeseen challenges, and it wasn't long before their bond was put to the ultimate test. One evening, Samuel collapsed unexpectedly, his health deteriorating at an alarming rate. The once lively and strong young man was now frail and weak, his life hanging in the balance. The elderly woman, consumed with worry, rushed him to the hospital, her heart pounding with fear. As she sat in the cold, sterile waiting room, time seemed to stretch endlessly. Every minute that passed without news felt like a lifetime, and she could only pray that her beloved son would be okay. When the nurse finally emerged, her face was ashen, her expression grim. The elderly woman's heart skipped a beat, sensing that something was terribly wrong. With a voice heavy with the weight of what she was about to reveal, the nurse explained that during the examination, they had discovered something deeply disturbing. The elderly woman listened in stunned silence as the nurse detailed the shocking truth, a truth that had been hidden for all these years, now brought to light in the most devastating of circumstances. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, the elderly woman felt her world shatter around her. The child she had raised, the son she had loved with all her heart, was connected to her in ways she could never have imagined. The revelation was a cruel twist of fate, one that left her grappling with a flood of emotions: horror, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal by life itself. The truth, once hidden in the shadows, now loomed large, casting a dark pall over everything she thought she knew. In that moment, she was left to confront the heartbreaking reality of her past, her present, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Jeffrey, though well acquainted with Angela's bold and unpredictable nature, couldn't help but steal anxious glances at the house as they approached, his mind racing with thoughts of how his mother, Rebecca, would react to the unexpected visitor. The tension in the air was palpable, and Angela, ever the provocateur, picked up on it instantly. "Just wait until your mom sees me," she teased, her voice dripping with a playful yet defiant challenge. "I bet she never imagined you'd bring someone like me home." Her words were a deliberate taunt, not just toward Jeffrey, but toward the very life he was beginning to resent: the small-town simplicity, the unspoken rules, and the expectations he had grown weary of. Jeffrey responded with a lopsided grin, a blend of anticipation and dread swirling within him. Part of him was eager to see the shock on Rebecca's face, to push back against the constraints he felt suffocating him. But another part, the part still tethered to his mother's love and approval, feared the fallout. "She'll manage," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Just try not to be too much, okay?" His voice held a note of pleading, though deep down he knew asking Angela to tone herself down was as futile as trying to stop a storm with a whisper. As they stepped into the house, Angela's presence seemed to overwhelm the space instantly. Her energy was electric, restless, and impossible to ignore, clashing with the quiet, orderly atmosphere Rebecca had carefully cultivated over the years. "Mom, this is Angela," Jeffrey introduced her with a tone that hinted at both defiance and a weary acceptance of the confrontation that was sure to follow. "She's my new friend from the city. I hope you two get along." Rebecca, who had been busy in the kitchen, emerged just in time to catch the last of his words. She paused in the doorway, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the sight of Angela, a whirlwind of bold fashion and unapologetic attitude, a stark contrast to the understated calm Rebecca valued. Rebecca's heart tightened, her maternal instincts flaring up in concern. She could sense the potential for disruption that Angela embodied, and it set her on edge. "Nice to meet you," Rebecca greeted her, her voice carefully neutral, though the underlying apprehension was unmistakable. "I didn't realize we were having company today." Angela, unfazed by the subtle tension, made herself at home in a way that was both brazen and unsettling. "Oh, it was a spur-of-the-moment thing," she replied with a casual wave, her tone laced with a hint of challenge. "You know, life on the road, no plans, just going where the wind takes me." She sauntered over to the sofa, flopping down with an air of ownership, her dusty boots leaving marks on the pristine carpet without a second thought. Rebecca's gaze followed Angela's every move, noting the deliberate disregard for the order she had worked so hard to maintain. Each word and action from Angela felt like a direct affront to the stability and respect Rebecca cherished in her home. Suppressing a sigh, she turned to Jeffrey, her expression softening but her concern evident. "Jeffrey," she said, her voice calm but firm, "could we speak in the kitchen for a moment?" Once in the kitchen, away from Angela's bold presence, Rebecca didn't waste any time. She looked at her son, the boy she had raised with so much love and care, and felt a pang of sadness mixed with fear. "Jeffrey," she began, her voice low but steady, "I've always tried to support your decisions, even when I didn't agree with them. But bringing Angela here without any notice, and seeing the way she's acting, it worries me. I'm concerned about the influence she might have on you, on us, and on this home." Her words were filled with a mother's love and deep-seated anxiety, hoping to reach the part of Jeffrey that still cared about the values she had tried to instill in him. Rebecca wasn't just worried about Angela's behavior, she feared what this choice said about the direction Jeffrey's life was heading. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and shared memories, now felt heavy with the unspoken tension between them. Jeffrey squared his shoulders, a defensive edge already creeping into his posture. Angela is different, Mom. She gets what it feels like to be trapped in a life that doesn't fit, that keeps you tethered to a place you don't want to be. She makes me feel alive. He shot back, his words less about Angela herself and more about his own restlessness, his deep-seated need to break free from the life he felt suffocating him. Rebecca let out a soft sigh, the weight of her concerns pressing down on her. She could see that this was more than just a simple rebellion. It was a cry for a freedom he believed he needed, even if it meant embracing risks he wasn't prepared to handle. The real challenge wasn't Angela, it was the pull of a world that Jeffrey yearned to explore but might not yet fully understand. Jeffrey, all I want is for you to be happy, but I also need you to be safe and to think things through, she said, her voice tender but edged with the seriousness of a mother's concern. Angela might seem exciting, but she also seems to take everything lightly, without considering the consequences. That's a dangerous way to live. Jeffrey met his mother's gaze, his eyes hardened with the frustration of feeling misunderstood. The rebellion brewing inside him threatened to spill over, and he struggled to keep it in check. You just don't get it, Mom. With Angela, I can be myself, no judgments, no limits. That's what I want, he replied, his voice thick with the desperation of someone longing to escape the confines of expectation, to carve out a space where he could exist on his own terms. Rebecca's heart ached as she listened, feeling the growing chasm between them, a gulf created not by Angela, but by the differing paths they envisioned for Jeffrey's future. She knew that pushing too hard would only drive him further away, but the idea of standing by in silence felt like a betrayal of everything she had tried to teach him. Okay, Jeffrey, she said quietly, her voice carrying a mix of resignation and hope. Just be careful, please. And remember, don't lose sight of who you are, of where you come from. Don't let anyone, not even Angela, take that away from you. With a tenderness that belied the tension in the room, Rebecca leaned in and pressed a kiss to Jeffrey's forehead. It was a gesture steeped in love, an attempt to bridge the gap between them with the only thing she knew would endure her unwavering affection for her son. When they returned to the living room, Angela was casually examining the few knickknacks that adorned the shelves, her curiosity tinged with an air of indifference. Rebecca, trying to mask her unease, forced herself to adopt a more welcoming demeanor. Angela, I hope you feel at home here, she said, her tone warm but cautious. Then, turning to Jeffrey, she added, why don't you show her around town before dinner? It might give you both a chance to enjoy the evening. Angela's smile widened, brimming with confidence. I'd love that. Let's see what this place has to offer, Jeffrey. It's about time we explored, she said, grabbing Jeffrey's hand with a familiarity that didn't escape Rebecca's notice. There was something in Angela's manner, a subtle urgency, as if there was a hidden agenda behind her eagerness to leave. But whatever it was, Rebecca couldn't quite put her finger on it. As Angela tugged Jeffrey toward the door, he hesitated for a moment, turning back to face Rebecca. His expression softened, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes that caught her off guard. Without warning, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a hug that was both unexpected and deeply poignant. It was such a rare gesture that Rebecca found herself momentarily frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden rush of emotion. Take care, Mom, Jeffrey whispered, his voice muffled against her shoulder. The words, simple as they were, carried a weight that Rebecca couldn't fully decipher, leaving her with a sense of foreboding mixed with an enduring love that refused to fade, no matter how wide the gap between them grew. As he pulled away and followed Angela out the door, Rebecca stood in the doorway, her heart heavy with a mixture of love, worry, and the bittersweet realization that her son was no longer the little boy she could protect from the world. The hug, though tender, felt strangely final, like a gesture of parting rather than reassurance. It left Rebecca unsettled, a dark cloud of worry forming in her mind. As Jeffrey pulled away, something seemed to flicker in his eyes, an urgency, perhaps even a hint of guilt. He lingered for a moment, as if debating with himself, before abruptly turning and heading towards his room. The faint sounds of zippers being pulled and the soft clatter of objects hastily gathered filled the otherwise quiet house, breaking the stillness with a sense of urgency that didn't sit well with Rebecca. Alarmed and curious, she followed him, her steps quickening as her concern deepened. She found Jeffrey in his room, hurriedly packing a backpack with far more than what would be needed for a simple walk around town. The sight of him stuffing clothes and other essentials into the bag made her heart race with a mix of fear and confusion. "Jeffrey, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice tinged with both worry and bewilderment. "Why are you packing so much?" "I only mentioned a short walk around town, not an overnight trip. I don't want you staying out too late." Jeffrey, caught off guard by her sudden appearance, quickly zipped the backpack shut, his expression faltering as he turned to face her. He tried to muster a casual smile, but the nervousness in his eyes betrayed him. "Oh, it's nothing," Mommy said, his voice too quick, too eager to dismiss her concerns. "Angela and I just thought we'd camp out tonight, under the stars. It'll be fun." The words tumbled out in a rush, and even as he spoke them, they sounded hollow, unconvincing. Rebecca studied him, her maternal instincts screaming that something was off. The hastily packed bag, the poorly concocted excuse, it all felt wrong. The hug, too, lingered in her mind, its unsettling undertone now making sense in the context of what she was seeing. "Are you sure, Jeffrey?" she pressed gently, her voice betraying the growing anxiety she felt. "You've never mentioned wanting to camp before. This seems so sudden." Jeffrey nodded too quickly, avoiding her gaze as he reached for the backpack. "It's just something Angela thought of last minute," he replied, the words lacking conviction. "Everything's fine, Mom, I promise." Before she could voice any more concerns, he slung the backpack over his shoulder and brushed past her, his departure swift and decisive. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Rebecca standing alone in the quiet of the room, her heart heavy with the weight of her unspoken fears. As the silence settled back into the house, it felt different this time, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. Rebecca moved slowly back to the living room, each step echoing ominously on the hardwood floor. The emptiness of the house seemed to expand around her, the absence of her son's presence leaving a void that felt too large, too unbearable. She sank into the armchair, her gaze unfocused, lost in the unsettling stillness that now pervaded her home. "What are you planning, Jeffrey?" she whispered to herself, the words barely audible, as if speaking them aloud would make the possibility more real, more terrifying. The idea that he might be planning to leave, truly leave, not just for a night but perhaps for good, sent a chill down her spine. But why? Why would he do this now, after everything they had been through together? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more painful than the last, as she tried to piece together the puzzle of her son's behavior. The fear of losing him, of seeing him walk out of her life and into a world she wasn't sure he was ready for, gnawed at her insides, leaving her breathless with anxiety. "I should have seen this coming," she muttered, her voice thick with self-reproach. "I should have known something was wrong." The thought that she might have missed the signs, that she hadn't done enough to understand his struggles, cut deeply. The possibility that Jeffrey was planning to run away with Angela, abandoning his home, his life, and, most painfully, her, filled Rebecca with a dread she couldn't name. "Wasn't I a good mother?" she asked herself, the doubt and uncertainty flooding her mind. Every decision she had made, every moment she had spent raising Jeffrey, now seemed to hang in the balance, as if his potential departure was a reflection of her failures rather than his need for freedom. She could only sit there, lost in a storm of emotions, as the realization that she might lose her son gripped her with a fear more profound than any she had ever known. Rebecca couldn't stay still. The unease gnawed at her, propelling her to pace the length of the room, each step a desperate attempt to untangle the knot of emotions tightening in her chest. She replayed every conversation with Jeffrey, every fleeting look they had exchanged in the days leading up to this moment, searching for the signs she feared she had overlooked. Maybe I should have pushed less, listened more, she muttered to herself, the self-doubt cutting deep. Maybe there's something Angela offers him that I couldn't, something he needed. The house, usually a place of warmth and solace, now felt cold and empty, each room echoing with the silence left in Jeffrey's wake. As the night deepened, Rebecca found herself standing by the window, her eyes fixed on the road outside. The dim streetlights cast long shadows, and she clung to the hope, however faint, that any moment now, Jeffrey would reappear. She imagined him walking back through the gate, his familiar figure illuminated by the glow of the lights, and with him, a return to the life she knew. But as the hours crept by and the darkness outside thickened, that hope began to erode, dissipating like mist at dawn. What if he really left? What if I've lost him forever? The questions looped through her mind, relentless and unforgiving, feeding her growing despair. She felt as though she was drowning in a sea of what-ifs, each wave pulling her further into a chasm of fear and regret. The fear of losing Jeffrey, of him slipping beyond her reach, was a wound that bled more with each passing minute. Meanwhile, miles away, Jeffrey and Angela had found refuge in a small rental house in a neighboring town, a place that, to them, felt like a different world. The house was modest, its exterior worn and weathered by time, but to Jeffrey, it was a sanctuary, a place where he could shed the weight of expectations and live by his own rules. It was a world far removed from the roots and rules he had fled, offering a sense of freedom that he had long craved. In those early days, the couple settled into their new life, creating a routine that was both simple and satisfying. The house, though humble, began to feel like a home as they filled it with their presence, their dreams, and the excitement of starting anew. One evening, as twilight gave way to the deep blue of night, Jeffrey and Angela sat in the small kitchen, sharing a meal they had thrown together from what little they had. The dim light from a single lamp cast a soft glow over them, the atmosphere intimate and calm. But that calm was shattered when Angela, her expression unusually serious, placed her hand over Jeffrey's, halting his movements. "Jeffrey," she began, her voice tentative, "I need to tell you something." She hesitated, her eyes searching his for reassurance before she could continue. "I'm pregnant." The words hit Jeffrey like a bolt of lightning, electrifying every nerve in his body. "Pregnant," he echoed, the word reverberating in his mind as the reality of it began to sink in. A storm of emotions swirled within him: surprise, fear, uncertainty. But then, unexpectedly, a sense of acceptance began to emerge, slowly but surely taking root in his heart. He looked into Angela's eyes, searching for her reaction, for a hint of what this meant for them. "You're pregnant," he repeated, the weight of the situation beginning to settle. "We're going to have a baby." The realization hit him fully then, a mix of wonder and gravity in his voice as he spoke the words aloud. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change and preparation. Jeffrey, who had left home with little more than a desire to break free, now found himself faced with the prospect of fatherhood. The life he had imagined, one free from the constraints of responsibility, began to shift into something he hadn't anticipated but somehow felt ready to embrace. He took on various temporary jobs, working long hours and saving every penny for the child who would soon enter their lives. Each day brought a new challenge, but also a growing sense of purpose. Angela, too, transformed during this time. The rental house, once just a shelter from the world, began to take on the warmth and character of a true home. She decorated the space, adding touches of comfort and love in every corner, as they both prepared for the arrival of their baby. The anticipation was palpable, infusing their daily lives with a quiet joy that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty that had marked the beginning of their journey. For Jeffrey, The prospect of sleepless nights and the sound of a baby's cry no longer seemed daunting, but rather something to look forward to. He often found himself imagining what it would be like to hold his child, to watch them grow and experience the world. In those moments, his thoughts would drift back to Rebecca, and he wondered how she would react to the news that she was going to be a grandmother. He thought about the last conversation they had, the tension that had hung in the air, and the worry that had been etched on her face. A part of him longed to reach out, to share this new chapter with her, but another part, the one that had driven him to leave in the first place, held him back. He didn't know how to bridge the gap between them, didn't know how to explain the choices he had made or the path he was now on. But in those quiet moments, as he and Angela prepared for the life they were about to bring into the world, Jeffrey felt a growing resolve. He knew he would have to face Rebecca eventually, to explain and seek her understanding, if not her approval. He could only hope that when that time came, she would see that despite everything, he was still her son, and that he was trying to find his own way in the world, just as she had always taught him to do. "I don't know if I should tell my mother about this," Jeffrey muttered to himself, staring at his phone as if it were a lifeline he couldn't bring himself to grasp. It had been months since he had left his childhood home, slipping away without a word, leaving behind the life he had known and the woman who had raised him. Part of him yearned to share his news with her, to tell her about the impending arrival of her grandchild, to seek her comfort and wisdom as he faced the unknown. But pride and the guilt of his abrupt departure held him back, creating a barrier he wasn't sure he could cross. When the day of the birth finally arrived, the culmination of months of anticipation and preparation, Jeffrey and Angela walked into the hospital hand in hand. The tension between them was palpable, a mixture of excitement and nervousness that neither could shake. The sterile smell of the hospital, the bright lights, and the bustle of medical staff only added to the surreal atmosphere. Angela was quickly taken to the preparation room, her hand slipping from Jeffrey's as she was wheeled away, leaving him alone in the waiting area, his heart pounding in his chest. The minutes crawled by, each one stretching out longer than the last. Every sound, every step in the corridor made Jeffrey's heart leap in his chest as he waited for news. Any news. The anticipation was agonizing, a physical weight pressing down on him. He couldn't sit still, pacing the small room, his mind racing with thoughts of what was happening beyond those doors. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor approached him. The man's face was drawn with fatigue, but there was a warm, genuine smile on his lips. "Congratulations, you have a healthy baby boy," he announced. In that instant, all the anxiety, all the fear that had gripped Jeffrey melted away, replaced by a rush of joy so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. When he entered the room where Angela lay, she was resting, her eyes half closed in exhaustion, but in her arms she cradled a small bundle wrapped in soft blankets. The sight of his son, for the first time tiny, perfect, and full of life, brought tears to Jeffrey's eyes. He approached slowly, almost reverently, his breath catching in his throat as he gazed down at the miracle before him. "He's perfect," Jeffrey whispered, his voice thick with emotion as tears welled up in his eyes. The little boy, their son, was a symbol of hope, a beacon of a new beginning in the tumultuous journey that was his life. Angela, though exhausted, managed a radiant smile, her eyes glowing with the same profound love and pride that Jeffrey felt. For a brief moment, everything was perfect. The world had shrunk to just the three of them, cocooned in the warmth of their shared joy. But then, without warning, the room was filled with a sharp, insistent beeping from the machines beside Angela's bed. Jeffrey's heart skipped a beat. He turned to the monitor and felt a cold dread wash over him as he saw the flat line, a stark, unforgiving signal that something had gone terribly wrong. "Angela," he called out, his voice trembling with fear as he turned back to her. But there was no response. Her eyes had drifted shut, her face growing alarmingly pale. Panic surged through Jeffrey, his mind struggling to process the sudden, horrifying shift. "Angela," he shouted again, louder this time, his voice cracking with desperation. The urgency in his voice alerted the medical staff, and within moments, doctors and nurses flooded into the room, their faces masks of professional focus as they began to work on Angela. Jeffrey was gently but firmly pushed aside, his hands shaking, his eyes glued to Angela's still form. The room filled with the sounds of frantic activity, the clatter of medical equipment, the hurried instructions of the doctors, and the heart-wrenching cries of his newborn son, who seemed to sense the mounting tension in the air. Jeffrey stood frozen, helpless, as he watched the life he had just begun to build unravel before his eyes. The minutes dragged on as the medical team fought to revive Angela, but their efforts were in vain. The flat line on the monitor persisted, the harsh beep of the machine echoing in Jeffrey's ears. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the room fell silent. The doctors exchanged somber glances before one of them turned to Jeffrey, shaking his head in a silent acknowledgement of what had just happened. Angela was gone. The realization hit Jeffrey like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. The woman he loved, the mother of his child, had been taken from him in the very moment that should have marked the happiest day of his life. The cries of his newborn son, now piercing through the oppressive silence, only deepened the despair that gripped him. Jeffrey's legs gave way, and he collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands, as the tears finally came, tears of grief, of loss, of a sorrow too vast to comprehend. The hours that followed passed in a blur for Jeffrey. He was led through the necessary procedures, signing papers and making decisions he was too numb to fully process. Every task, every word spoken to him, felt distant and disconnected, as if he were moving through a fog. All he could think of was Angela, her smile, her laugh, the life they had dreamed of sharing together, now shattered. The rented house, once a symbol of their new life, now seemed like an empty shell, devoid of the warmth and hope they had filled it with. As he cradled his son in his arms, Jeffrey felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like never before. He was a father now, but the joy that role should have brought was overshadowed by the gaping void left by Angela's absence. He couldn't help but think of Rebecca, of how he had left her without a word, and how he wished more than anything to hear her voice, to find solace in her arms. But the distance between them felt insurmountable, and the pain of his loss was too fresh, too raw. In the quiet of the hospital room, with his son's soft breathing the only sound, Jeffrey made a silent vow. He would do everything in his power to give his son the life he deserved, to honor the memory of the woman who had given him this precious gift. But deep down, he knew that nothing would ever fill the void that Angela had left behind. When it was finally time to leave the hospital, Jeffrey cradled his son in his arms, a tiny, fragile life that now depended entirely on him. This small bundle of joy, so full of potential, was also a living, breathing bond with Angela, a piece of her that would live on. The weight of this realization bore down on him as he stepped out into the world, his heart heavy with both love and grief. The drive back to the small rented house felt like a dream, the streets blurring together as Jeffrey's thoughts spun in an endless loop of sorrow and fear. Upon arriving home, the silence of the modest residence was suffocating, a stark and cruel reminder of what he had lost. The echoes of a life that could have been filled the emptiness around him. He sat down on the worn couch, his son nestled in his arms, and looked at the baby's face. Each delicate feature, his tiny nose, his soft cheeks, his barely there eyebrows, was a bittersweet reminder of Angela. Her presence was etched into every part of this child, a beautiful yet painful reminder of the love they had shared. "How am I going to do this without you?" Angela, Jeffrey murmured, his voice breaking as the magnitude of his new reality began to sink in. "How can I be both father and mother to our son?" His mind raced with doubts, the enormity of the responsibility looming over him like a dark cloud. The baby stirred and began to cry, a sharp, piercing sound that yanked Jeffrey back to the present. The cries weren't just a demand, they were a reminder that, despite his overwhelming grief, he had a duty to fulfill. His son needed him. "I promise you, Angela," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the baby's cries, "and I promise you too, my little one. I will do everything I can. I will love you, protect you, and raise you to be strong and brave, just like your mother." The words hung in the air, a solemn vow in the stillness of the room. Jeffrey's heart ached with the weight of that promise, knowing the journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. As the night wore on, Jeffrey gently rocked his son, singing a lullaby that Angela had often hummed during her pregnancy. The melody, once a symbol of their shared hopes and dreams, now felt like a lifeline, a way to keep Angela's memory alive. The pain of her loss was still raw, an open wound that bled into every moment. But the presence of his son, this little life they had created together, offered Jeffrey a fragile thread of hope, a reason to keep going, to fight, to live. But as the hours ticked by, doubts began to creep in. Jeffrey couldn't shake the fear that he might not be up to the task. "But I don't know how to be a father," he confessed quietly to the sleeping baby. "Maybe I won't even manage. Perhaps it's better for you to stay with someone who really knows how to raise you the right way." In the quiet of the night, as his son slept peacefully in his arms, Jeffrey found himself overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions. The pain of losing Angela was an ever-present shadow, looming large and inescapable. Sitting alone at the kitchen table, the dim light of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room, Jeffrey made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives forever. With trembling hands, he reached for a pen and paper, the enormity of what he was about to do weighing heavily on him. He began to write a letter to his mother, Rebecca. Each word was a struggle, a painful testament to the love he felt for his son and the unbearable grief that consumed him in Angela's absence. He poured his heart onto the page, explaining how life had become a series of gray, clouded days, as if the sun had set on his world, never to rise again. In the letter, Jeffrey revealed the birth of his son, Scott, and the tragic death of Angela, the woman who had brought so much light into his life, only to be taken away too soon. He described the overwhelming burden of trying to raise Scott on his own, his fear that he wouldn't be able to give his son the life he deserved. "Mom," he wrote, his tears smudging the ink, "you are the only person I trust to care for Scott, to love and protect him as if he were your own. Please take care of him for me." With the letter finished, Jeffrey gently placed Scott in a basket lined with soft blankets. He stood for a long moment, looking down at his sleeping son, memorizing every detail of the little face that bore such a striking resemblance to Angela. His heart ached with the knowledge of what he was about to do, but he convinced himself it was the best decision, the only decision he could make. In the dead of night, with the world around him shrouded in darkness, Jeffrey drove to Rebecca's house. The roads were eerily quiet, each mile feeling like a journey deeper into his own despair. When he arrived at the house where he had grown up, memories of his childhood flooded his mind, bittersweet and painful in their familiarity. Jeffrey carefully placed the basket at the front door, the letter resting beside his son, a silent plea for Rebecca to understand, to forgive him for what he was about to do. His hands shook as he set everything in place, his heart screaming at him to stop, to take Scott back and figure things out on his own. But the memory of Angela, the promise he had made to her to protect their son, drove him forward. "I hope you can forgive me one day, son," Jeffrey whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I know you'll be in good hands." Without allowing himself a final glance, fearing it would shatter his resolve, Jeffrey turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the night. The tears streamed down his face as he left behind the most precious part of himself, his heart, his son. When Rebecca opened the door that fateful morning, the last thing she expected was to find a tiny bundle waiting for her on the doorstep. Her heart skipped a beat as she looked down and saw Scott, a small, innocent face peeking out from the soft blankets. The initial surprise quickly morphed into shock as she noticed the letter resting beside him, her hands trembling as she picked it up. With a growing sense of dread, she unfolded the paper and began to read Jeffrey's words. Each sentence felt like a blow, revealing the depths of Jeffrey's suffering, the unimaginable loss he had endured, and his overwhelming despair. His words painted a picture of a man lost in his own world of pain, unable to see a future for himself, but desperately clinging to the hope of a better life for his son. As she read, Rebecca's heart broke anew, not just for the son who had left her, but for the grandson who had been entrusted to her care, a living reminder of the love and loss that had brought him to her door. With Scott now cradled in her arms, Rebecca allowed herself to cry tears of grief for Jeffrey's absence and the profound sadness of knowing he was out there, somewhere, alone in his pain. But amidst the sorrow, there was also a bittersweet joy. Scott, so small and fragile, was a part of Jeffrey, a living, breathing piece of the son she had lost. Holding him close, Rebecca made a silent promise, a vow that came from the deepest part of her heart. "I will take care of him, Jeffrey," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I will love Scott with all my heart, just as I loved you. And I will wait, always wait for the day when you find your way back home." As the sun began to rise, bathing the room in a soft, golden light, Rebecca rocked Scott gently, humming a lullaby she hadn't sung in years. The dawn brought with it a sense of renewal, a promise of a new beginning. In that quiet, tender moment, she felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that, despite the pain and the uncertainty, there was still love, still something worth fighting for. Rebecca knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but she also knew that together, she and Scott could face anything. And maybe, just maybe, one day Jeffrey would find his way back to them. The years passed since that morning, and Rebecca's life became intertwined with Scott's. She welcomed him into her home and her heart without hesitation, filling the void left by Jeffrey's departure with all the love and dedication she could muster. Scott grew up under her watchful, loving care, and Rebecca strove every day to be both a mother and a mentor to him. The truth about his origins remained a closely guarded secret, known only to Rebecca, a burden she carried with both love and sadness. Now, at 5 years old, Scott was a child full of life and joy. His infectious smile could light up even the darkest of rooms, and his laughter, pure and unrestrained, echoed through the house like a beacon of hope. He had an insatiable curiosity, his bright eyes always searching for new adventures, and an intelligence that often took Rebecca by surprise. "Grandma, why is the sky blue?" he would ask with genuine wonder, or "what makes the wind blow?" His questions were endless, and Rebecca delighted in answering each one, marveling at his thirst for knowledge and his eager mind. Rebecca took on the role of both educator and guardian, teaching Scott not only the lessons of school but also the lessons of life. She filled his days with stories of their family, weaving together a tapestry of memories and morals, while carefully omitting the painful truths about his father. She taught him the importance of kindness, the value of honesty, and the strength that comes from courage. "Scott," she would say, looking into his wide, attentive eyes, "being brave doesn't mean you're never afraid. It means that even when you are scared, you still do what is right." Scott absorbed every word, his young mind soaking up the wisdom Rebecca imparted like a sponge. He grew not just in height but in character, blossoming under her guidance into a child of whom Rebecca was immensely proud. Every day she saw glimpses of Jeffrey in him, the way he furrowed his brow when deep in thought, the way his smile could brighten her darkest days, and it filled her with both joy and longing. She held on to the hope that one day Scott might reunite with his father, and that Jeffrey, wherever he was, would be proud of the boy he had left in her care. Rebecca knew that she had taken on a tremendous responsibility, but she also knew that Scott had given her life new meaning. Together, they faced each day, and as Scott grew, so did Rebecca's resolve to keep her promise to Jeffrey. The challenges they encountered only strengthened the bond between them, and through it all, Rebecca never stopped waiting, never stopped hoping that one day Jeffrey would find his way back to the home he had left behind. As Scott grew into a young man under Rebecca's loving care, Jeffrey remained a distant shadow in his son's life, a ghost watching from the sidelines. Unseen and unknown, he would observe from afar, hidden in the shadows whenever Rebecca took Scott out. Whether it was to the park, to school, or just for a walk, Jeffrey would find a vantage point, staying just out of sight. Watching his son play, laugh, and run with the unrestrained joy of childhood filled Jeffrey with a bittersweet mix of emotions. He marveled at how much Scott had grown, at how closely he resembled Angela with each passing year. But with every glimpse came the sharp reminder of all that Jeffrey had lost and the life he had chosen to abandon. Jeffrey never approached, never revealed his presence. He convinced himself that he was doing the right thing, that watching from a distance was what was best for Scott. He is happy, he is safe. Jeffrey would tell himself, forcing himself to believe that leaving Scott with Rebecca was the best decision he could have made. But no matter how much he tried to convince himself, the longing for his son gnawed at him, an unrelenting ache that drained the joy from his life. The void left by his absence in Scott's life was a black hole, constantly pulling at Jeffrey's heart, leaving him feeling hollow and incomplete. One afternoon, as he watched Scott playing in the park under Rebecca's watchful eye, Jeffrey's thoughts drifted to the future. Will he hate me for leaving? Will he understand why I did what I did? These questions haunted him, the uncertainty of whether or not to reveal himself to Scott one day gnawing at his conscience. The fear of rejection, the fear of not being forgiven, kept him in the shadows, even as his love for Scott urged him to step into the light. Rebecca, meanwhile, saw Scott's future with a mix of hope and apprehension. She knew the day was fast approaching when she would have to tell Scott the truth about his father, but the thought of it filled her with dread. How can I explain Jeffrey to him without breaking his heart, she would ask herself, the weight of that impending conversation pressing down on her. The thought of Scott's possible pain and confusion made her heart ache, but she also knew that he deserved to know the truth, no matter how difficult it would be. Despite their fears and uncertainties, both Rebecca and Jeffrey continued to love and protect Scott in their own ways. Rebecca with her constant presence, her unwavering love and support, and Jeffrey with his distant vigilance, his silent guardianship. Each played a vital role in Scott's life, their destinies intertwined by the bond they shared with him, a bond Scott had yet to fully understand. As the years passed, Scott grew into a young man. Now 15, he carried not only the genetic legacy of his parents, but also the burgeoning rebellion that often accompanies adolescence. He was a free spirit, with a thirst for independence that frequently put him at odds with the rules Rebecca had set for him. Their arguments, though heated, never crossed the line into disrespect, a testament to the deep bond between them. But each clash was a reminder to Rebecca that Scott was growing up, and that the day she had long dreaded was drawing nearer. One hot summer afternoon, one of these arguments came to a head in the kitchen. Scott was adamant about attending a music festival with some friends from school, a plan Rebecca viewed as imprudent. She knew the festival's reputation, the kind of influences that lurked there, and it filled her with concern. "Scott, I'm only worried about you," she tried to explain, her voice gentle but firm. "That festival is no place for a young man your age." "Grandma, I'm already 15, Scott retorted, frustration tinging his voice. He wasn't looking for a fight, he just wanted to be understood. "I know how to take care of myself. You trust me, don't you? I just want a little freedom, to feel like I can make my own choices." Rebecca sighed, seeing the young man before her who was so eager to spread his wings. "I trust you, Scott. It's the world out there I don't trust," she replied, her voice heavy with the weight of years of experience. She knew that Scott's desire for independence was natural, but the thought of letting him go, of potentially losing him, was terrifying. As they stood there, locked in a battle of wills, Scott suddenly paled, his expression shifting from frustration to one of pain and fear. Clutching his sides, he doubled over slightly, his face contorting in discomfort. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "something's wrong. There's something wrong inside me. It hurts." Rebecca's heart leapt into her throat, her concern immediately turning to panic. She rushed to his side, her hands hovering over him, unsure where to start. "Scott, what is it? Talk to me, my dear. Tell me what's hurting so I can help you," she urged, her voice trembling with fear. She watched helplessly as Scott writhed in pain, her mind racing through possibilities, desperate to understand what was happening to her grandson. But Scott's pain only seemed to intensify, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. Rebecca's fear mounted as she realized this wasn't just a minor discomfort, something was seriously wrong. "We need to get you to a doctor, Scott," she said, her voice firm despite the terror gripping her heart. She quickly grabbed her keys, helping Scott as best she could toward the door, praying silently that whatever was happening, they would reach help in time. Without a moment's hesitation, Rebecca called an ambulance, her heart pounding with fear as she held Scott close. The ride to the hospital felt like an eternity, the flashing lights outside the window reflecting her own frantic thoughts. Once they arrived, Scott was quickly taken in by the medical team, and after a series of urgent tests, the doctors delivered the diagnosis: Scott was suffering from an acute kidney crisis, a condition he had unknowingly inherited from his mother, Angela. Rebecca felt a jolt of shock as the doctors explained the situation. Angela had battled chronic kidney disease, a fact Jeffrey had briefly mentioned in his letter. But it was a detail Rebecca had never imagined would resurface in Scott so many years later. As she sat in the waiting room, her thoughts raced, reflecting on the cruel ironies of fate, how history seemed to repeat itself in ways she could never have predicted. Why didn't I tell him about his father, about everything? She asked herself, guilt and regret gnawing at her. Perhaps if she had shared the full truth with Scott sooner, he would have been better prepared to face this challenge. As Scott began to recover in the hospital, he looked at Rebecca with a new depth of understanding, his eyes reflecting the fear and confusion that the physical pain had brought to the surface. "Grandma," he asked, his voice soft but filled with a need for answers, "I didn't know something like this could happen to me. The doctor said it's hereditary. Did you know?" Rebecca took Scott's hand, feeling the weight of the moment. She knew it was time to open her heart and share the story she had kept hidden for so long. The truth, though painful, was something Scott deserved to know. "Scott," she began, her voice gentle but resolute, "there's a lot about your father and mother that you need to hear. It's a story of love, loss, and above all, hope. And it starts with me, with you, and with a decision that changed our lives forever." As the first light of dawn filtered into the hospital room, casting a serene glow over the scene, Rebecca settled beside Scott's bed. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts, ready to reveal the past she had kept locked away for so many years. "Your father, Jeffrey, was a young man full of life and dreams. Much like you are now," she began, her tone calm but weighted with the gravity of what she was about to share. "But he also faced many difficulties, battles within himself that led him to make some very hard decisions." Scott, with his curiosity piqued and a hint of anxiety in his eyes, listened intently. He had always known there were pieces of his past missing, and now those gaps were finally being filled. "And my mother?" he asked, unable to contain his curiosity about the woman he had never known but had always felt a deep connection to. Rebecca nodded, her eyes misting as she spoke. "Your mother, Angela, was an incredible woman. She was strong, loving, and she cared for you more than anything in the world. She and Jeffrey were so excited about your arrival, but sadly there were complications after you were born. Complications that took her from us far too soon." Rebecca's voice quivered with emotion as she relived those painful memories, but she pressed on, knowing Scott needed to hear the truth. Scott absorbed her words, his mind racing with the new information. What happened to my father after that? Why did he leave me with you? And why? Why did he just disappear from my life? Why didn't he ever come back to see us? Each answer Rebecca provided seemed to lead to more questions, and Scott's thirst for understanding only grew. Rebecca sighed, knowing that the hardest part of the story was yet to come. She looked into Scott's eyes, seeing not just a young boy but a young man who was ready to hear the truth. Your father was devastated by your mother's death, Scott. She explained, her voice heavy with the sorrow of the memories. He loved you more than anything, but he was lost in his grief. He believed that leaving you with me was the best way to give you a chance at a better life. He thought that by stepping aside, he was protecting you, even though it broke his heart to do so. Scott listened quietly, his expression a mix of sadness and understanding. Tears welled up in his eyes as he realized the depth of his father's pain and the sacrifices he had made. So he left, because he thought it was the best thing for me. Scott asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Rebecca nodded, squeezing his hand gently. Yes, he did. It wasn't an easy decision for him, and I know he's been watching over you from afar, even if you didn't know it. He's always cared about you, Scott. He just didn't know how to be in your life without causing more pain for both of you. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Rebecca's words sinking in. Scott wiped away his tears, a thoughtful look crossing his face. He had spent so many years wondering about his father, feeling a mix of anger, confusion, and longing. Now, he finally understood the complexity of the situation, the love and pain that had shaped his life in ways he had never realized. Do you think he'll ever come back? Scott asked softly, his voice filled with hope but also uncertainty. Rebecca looked at her grandson, seeing so much of Jeffrey in him. I don't know, Scott, but what I do know is that your father loves you, and he's always been proud of the young man you've become. Maybe one day when he's ready, he'll find his way back to you. Until then, we just have to keep living, keep loving, and keep hoping. Scott nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. The truth was painful, but it was also liberating. He had finally found the answers he had been searching for, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew he wasn't alone. He had Rebecca, and through her, he had a connection to his parents that he could carry with him as he continued to grow and navigate the challenges of life. As Rebecca and Scott sat together in the quiet hospital room, the sun continued to rise, filling the space with warmth and light. It was a new day, a new beginning for both of them. And as they faced the future together, they knew that no matter what, they would always have each other bound by the love that had carried them through the darkest of times. And he never tried to see me after that? To know how I was doing, Scott's question was loaded with an emotional complexity beyond his age. I am sure he watched over us from afar in some way, my dear, always ensuring you were okay, but never getting close. That's just how your father is. I believe everything he did was out of insecurity, for thinking he could not be a good enough father for you, Rebecca confessed. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a nurse, Mariana, who brought news about Scott's condition. We need to consider a kidney transplant, she said, the seriousness of her expression preparing them for the gravity of the situation. The news fell like a blow to Rebecca and Scott, a cruel reminder that Angela's chronic kidney disease had left a mark not only on the past but also on Scott's present and future. Rebecca, without hesitation, offered to be tested as a donor. I will do anything for him, she said, determined. However, tests revealed she was not compatible, nor were any other family members or neighbors who, moved by the situation, offered to help. The search for a compatible donor seemed increasingly desperate, each negative result adding more weight to Rebecca's shoulders. What are we going to do now, Grandma? I am very scared. I do not know what will happen to me. I wish my father were here now with you, Scott said, his voice weak but filled with a resilience that Rebecca knew he had inherited from his parents. Rebecca held Scott's hand, her expression firm despite the fear in her heart. "We will not give up, Scott. We will find a donor for you, no matter what it takes. You are strong, like your mother and father, and we will get through this together." At that moment, in the hospital room, with dawn heralding a new day, Rebecca and Scott faced the uncertainty of the future. But they knew that no matter how difficult the journey ahead, they would face it together. The love and determination they shared were unshakable, a force that united them against any adversity. "We will overcome this, Scott," believe Rebecca reinforced, a tender smile attempting to light up the shadow of worry on her face. What they did not know, however, was that a surprising event was about to change the course of their search, something that would challenge their expectations and bring new hope to a situation that seemed increasingly bleak. Later that morning, news from the hospital would bring surprising news, starting a new chapter in Scott's fight for life. The sunlight filtered through the hospital curtains, bathing the room in a soft, comforting glow. Rebecca, sitting by Scott's bed, held her grandson's hand, lost in worried thoughts about the future. Scott's condition had become the center of her world, each day a mix of hope and despair. It was in this state of reflection that Nurse Mariana entered the room, looking at Rebecca and began, "Mrs. Rebecca, we have good news. A compatible donor has been found for Scott. The surgery is scheduled as soon as possible," the nurse announced, her voice carrying a professional formality, but it was impossible to hide the hint of excitement. The news fell on Rebecca like rain in the desert. Tears of relief and gratitude welled up in her eyes as she squeezed Scott's hand, now awake and watching her with curiosity. "Scott, dear, a donor has been found. You are going to have the surgery," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Really, Grandma? I cannot believe it. We are really going to get through this." "I am so happy," Scott exclaimed, a glimmer of hope lighting up his eyes, which for so long had reflected the shadow of uncertainty and fear. "Really, my love. God sent us an angel, who we do not yet know, but who is willing to save your life," Rebecca replied, leaning in to hug Scott, her heart overflowing with joy and relief. As Rebecca and Scott embraced, wrapped in the renewed hope the news had brought, Jeffrey watched from afar, hidden in the shadows of his own life. The discovery of Scott's condition had been a shock to him, a painful awakening to how invisible he had become. Moved by a strength he did not know he still possessed, Jeffrey had taken the compatibility test, a silent step towards redemption, perhaps, or at least compensation for years of absence. When the result confirmed he was the perfect donor, a complex mix of relief and fear invaded Jeffrey. He could save Scott, but at the same time he faced the fear of reopening old wounds, of confronting the past he had left behind. With determination, he made the decision to donate anonymously, insisting that his identity be kept secret. "For you, my son, I will do this with all the love in the world." The surgery was scheduled quickly, the medical team moving efficiently to take advantage of the opportunity that could mean a new life for Scott. Rebecca, grateful and still incredulous at the turn of events, prepared Scott for the procedure, encouraging him with words of love and promises of a bright future. "You are strong, Scott. You will get through this and come out even stronger." "I have faith," Rebecca whispered, holding Scott's hand as he was wheeled into the operating room, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and faith. Jeffrey, from afar, sent his silent prayers, hoping that his decision would bring Scott the health and happiness he deserved. As Rebecca waited anxiously in the hospital, surrounded by the support of hospital staff, she felt a deep gratitude for the unknown donor, not knowing that he was closer than she could ever imagine. Inside the operating room, the medical team worked with precision and calm, each movement carefully coordinated to ensure the success of Scott's kidney transplant. Among those professionals was Nurse Mariana, whose experience had made her an observer of the small victories and moments of tension that characterized everyday life in the hospital. She watched the surgery, ensuring everything went smoothly, her gaze often resting on the young patient, fighting for a new chance at life. As the surgery neared its end, the medical team began to relax, the first signs that the procedure had been a success becoming evident. Mariana, checking Scott's vital signs, allowed herself a discreet smile, sharing a look of relief and satisfaction with the surgeons. Another miracle today, she thought, proud of the work they were doing. When Scott was finally taken to the recovery room, Mariana followed, ensuring he was comfortable and stable. It was then that Rebecca, anxious and hopeful, was allowed to see him. Entering the room and seeing Scott slowly waking up, emotions overwhelmed her, tears of gratitude and relief streaming down her face as she approached the bed. "He is doing well, Mrs. Rebecca. The surgery was a success. We are all very happy and proud of Scott's strength. We are very surprised. It was not an easy surgery, but he handled it wonderfully," Mariana informed with a warm smile. Rebecca, unable to find words, just nodded, holding Scott's hand. It was then that Mariana, trying to ease the tension with casual conversation, commented without thinking, "Indeed, Mrs. Rebecca, it is wonderful that the father's kidney was 100% compatible. It is rare to see such perfect compatibility." Rebecca froze, her emotions interrupted by a shock of surprise and confusion. "What do you mean, the father's kidney? If you are talking about Jeffrey, he did not tell me he was here, that he came back. This cannot be true," she asked, her voice trembling, her eyes wide as she searched Mariana's for an explanation. Mariana immediately realized her mistake. "Oh, I thought you knew. The anonymous donor was Scott's father." "I am sorry. I should not have assumed," Mariana hurriedly said, concern marking her face as she realized her blunder. Rebecca sat down, stunned by the revelation. Scott, now more alert, fixed his gaze on his grandmother, trying to understand the conversation. "My father," he murmured, the news planting seeds of doubt, curiosity, and a glimpse of hope in his heart. They left the hospital that day full of doubts. In the days that followed, as Scott recovered, Rebecca and he faced the complex reality of their family. Scott, now aware of his father's existence and the sacrifice he had made, was consumed by mixed feelings. On one hand, there was a deep gratitude for this final gesture of love. On the other, many questions about why Jeffrey chose to remain in the shadows, why he had stayed away for so long. Rebecca, equally shaken, struggled to reconcile the image of the son who had left with the man who anonymously had given Scott a second chance at life. "He always loved you, Scott, in his own way. He tried to do what he thought was right." Rebecca tried to explain, her words bringing comfort but also leaving room for more questions. After years of silence and distance, Jeffrey made the hardest decision of his life to face the past he had left behind and try to reconcile with Rebecca, the mother who had been left to care for his son, Scott. It was on a quiet afternoon, while Scott was at school, that Jeffrey finally found the courage to approach the house he once called home. Rebecca was in the garden, lost in her thoughts, when she noticed a familiar figure slowly approaching. Her heart raced as she recognized Jeffrey, the son she had loved and lost so many years ago. "Jeffrey," her voice was a mix of surprise and disbelief. "Mother, it is me." "I need to talk to you," Jeffrey began, hesitant, his eyes avoiding hers, fearing judgment and rejection. "I know I caused a lot of pain, more than I can express, and I do not expect you to forgive me. But I needed to see you, needed to try to explain." Rebecca listened in silence, emotions flooding her, a storm of sadness, anger, and surprisingly, a thread of relief at finally seeing her son again. "And Scott," she interrupted, her voice firm, "have you thought about him? He deserves to hear what you have to say. He deserves to know his father." Jeffrey lowered his head, accepting the truth in Rebecca's words, understanding the emotional damage he had caused both his mother and his son. "You are right. I want more than anything to have the chance to talk to Scott, to be a part of his life, if he will allow me." When Scott returned from school that day, Rebecca gently prepared him for the meeting, explaining that Jeffrey wanted to see him. Scott, though surprised, agreed to hear what his father had to say. Scott's initial rejection was evident, his posture rigid and his words cautious as he faced the man who was a stranger to him, but also his father. "Why have you come back now?" Scott asked, his voice carrying the weight of years of doubts and uncertainties. Jeffrey stood before Scott, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. He knew that finding the right words was crucial, words that could begin to heal the deep wounds he had caused by his absence. The weight of his mistakes hung heavily in the air, almost tangible, as he took a deep breath, searching for the courage to speak. "Scott," he began, his voice trembling slightly with the gravity of the moment, "I know I've made mistakes, more than I can count. The first left you when you needed me the most, and for that, I am deeply sorry. I was lost in my own pain, drowning in my grief, and because of that, I ended up causing you and your grandmother even more pain. But I'm here now, and I want to try to make things right, if you'll give me the chance." Jeffrey paused, watching his son's face intently, searching for any sign of how his words were being received. He could see the confusion, the hurt, and the longing in Scott's eyes, and it tore at him. "I know I can't expect everything to change overnight," he continued, his voice thick with emotion, "but I'm hoping that with time, we can build something, a relationship, perhaps. I don't want to lose any more time with you, Scott. I want to be here for you, in whatever way you'll let me." From a short distance, Rebecca observed the exchange with a heart full of conflicting emotions. The years of watching Scott grow, of loving him as her own, had been a gift, but they had also been tinged with the sorrow of Jeffrey's absence. Now, as she watched father and son tentatively reach out to one another, she felt a flicker of hope, but also a deep understanding of how fragile this moment was. The road ahead would not be easy, she knew that all too well. But in this small, tender moment, she saw a glimmer of possibility. The family had a chance to heal, to rebuild what had been broken by years of pain and regret. And somehow that was enough to take the first step toward an uncertain future, one that was full of both challenges and potential. "Scott," Jeffrey said again, struggling to keep his voice steady, "I know that nothing I say now can change the past. I lost myself, I lost you, and in doing so, I lost us everything we could have had. For that, I am truly sorry, more than I can ever express." Scott, who had spent so many years with unanswered questions and an aching void where his father's presence should have been, looked directly at Jeffrey. His eyes, once filled with anger and confusion, now showed a flicker of something else, a deep-seated desire to understand, to know the truth behind the decisions that had shaped his life. "I've always wanted to know about you," Scott said, his voice quiet but charged with emotion. "I wanted to know why you left. Why did you disappear when I needed you the most?" Jeffrey felt the full weight of his son's question, a question that had haunted him for years. He took another deep breath, willing himself to be honest, to be vulnerable in a way he had never been before. "I was scared," Scott, he admitted, his voice raw with the truth. "I was scared of not being good enough, of failing you the way I felt I had failed your mother. When Angela died, I was shattered. I didn't know how to cope. And I didn't know how to be the father you needed. But that's no excuse. I should have stayed. I should have stayed. I should have faced my fears and been there for you, instead of running away." As they stood there, the conversation began to flow more freely, each word peeling back the layers of pain and misunderstanding that had built up over the years. Jeffrey spoke of his love for Scott, of the guilt that had consumed him for leaving, and of his hope that they could start anew. Scott, in turn, began to see his father not just as the man who had abandoned him, but as a person who had been broken, who had made mistakes, but was now seeking redemption. "I want to try," Dad, Scott finally said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I want to try to get to know each other, to be a family, and to make up for all the time we lost. It won't be easy for me, and I know it won't be easy for you either. But I'm willing to make the effort because I've always dreamed of having a family, and I think we can be that for each other." The determination in Scott's voice marked the beginning of a new chapter for them, a chapter filled with challenges, yes, but also with the promise of something better. It was as though they were standing at the edge of a new journey, one that would require patience, understanding, and a willingness to forgive not just each other, but themselves as well. Sometime later, on a warm summer afternoon, the three of them, Rebecca, Jeffrey, and Scott, found themselves sitting together on the porch of their home. The golden light of the setting sun bathed them in a warm glow, casting long shadows across the yard. There was a sense of peace in the air, a quiet contentment that came from the hard-won reconciliation they had achieved. For the first time in many years, there was no tension, no unspoken words hanging between them, just a shared sense of belonging. Rebecca looked at Jeffrey and Scott, her heart swelling with a mixture of love, relief, and gratitude. "This moment," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "The three of us together. It's a dream I feared would never come true. My heart is at peace now, knowing that we're here together as a family." Jeffrey, feeling the warmth of his mother's hand in his, looked at her with deep appreciation and love. "Mother," he responded, his voice steady and sincere, "the strength and forgiveness you've shown me. I only hope I can offer the same to Scott. I've been given a second chance, and I'm not going to waste it. I'm here for whatever you both need, now and always." Scott, sitting beside them, felt a deep sense of fulfillment wash over him. For so long, he had wondered what it would be like to have a father, to be part of a complete family. Now, that dream was becoming a reality, and it felt even better than he had imagined. "I spent so many years imagining what it would be like to have a father," he said, his voice carrying both joy and a sense of relief. "Now I don't have to imagine anymore. We're together, and that's all that matters. Thank you for letting me finally know this part of my story." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a gentle twilight over the scene, the family, once fractured by pain and regret, found themselves reunited, their bonds strengthened by the shared experience of loss, forgiveness, and love. Jeffrey, who had finally found his way back, Rebecca, the resilient matriarch who had held them all together through the darkest times, and Scott, the link that had brought them back to one another, sat in peaceful silence, ready to face whatever the future held with renewed hope and love. They knew there would be challenges ahead, but they also knew that together they could face anything. The wounds of the past were beginning to heal, and with each passing day, the family grew stronger, bound by a love that had weathered the storm and emerged, finally, into the light. Now that you've heard this touching story of love, sacrifice, and redemption, what have you learned? Reflect on the journey of these characters and think about one lesson that you can bring into your own life. Perhaps it's the power of forgiveness, the importance of staying connected with loved ones, or the strength found in hope even in the darkest times. Please share in the comments below one thing you've learned from this story and how you plan to apply it in your life. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us continue to bring you stories that inspire and uplift.